So first of all, it's a pleasure to see you all virtually and a real privilege to be a part of this. I think I would start by saying we stand at the threshold of some incredibly important reforms for the SATCOM sector. And rather than dwell on the technology aspects of it, because I'm sure that over the course of the next couple of days, you're going to see lots of PowerPoints around footprints and technologies, etc. I thought I'd stop and take a little bit of a look back. And the rationale and the reason that I wanted to do that is, I've been, I've had the privilege of being part of the Indian SATCOM sector since essentially 1997, which is a long time and probably reveals more of my age than I'd like. But I think it's really important to stop and look at what the first set of reforms that occurred in about 2000, what was the impact that those reforms had, to measure and chart what the impact of those reforms were, and then sort of position ourselves looking forward as to what we can expect if we're successful in significantly liberalizing, opening up the next set of reforms, both in letter and spirit. So I think there's an important value in looking back and sort of assessing and judging how those reforms were implemented and how successful or unsuccessful we were. I'll make another comment, which is that satellites are an infrastructure. And for all of us that are present on this panel and that are part of this ecosystem, look at the role of satellites within the context of our own industry. What I think is really important is that satellite is a massive enabler for much more than our industry. Our industry exists as an infrastructure provider that allows many other businesses, many other services, many other capabilities to get delivered around the world and very specifically in the Indian context. And I think it's important that we don't lose sight of the multiplied value that a satellite connection can bring, that a satellite transponder can bring in an Indian context. So part of what I wanted to do was to look back, look at the leverage or the value that the initial set of reforms created in India, because I think that sets us up very well to understand what a new set of liberalized rules that would bring about many of the innovations that Dr. Subbarao and Tom talked about, what a lot of this can create in terms of its impact on the economy in total, not just for the satellite sector. So if we could go to the next couple of slides, Akash, if you could just click through, because it's a transition slide. Yeah, there we go. If you could click through another couple. And one more, please. Thank you. Right. So this kind of describes what happened to video in India when foreign providers were able to start to provide capacity, and what it created was a very competitive DTH landscape in India. Right? We started out with a single provider that was complemented by Free Dish back in 2000. We started to see, as more capacity became easily available, whether it was because of the launches that ISRO conducted and the growth of its capacity, for example, for Tata Sky and others, or the international capacity that was allowed to come into the market, we saw this proliferation of a large number of DTH operators. And I know one of the questions that had been asked many times is, do we really need so many satellite, DTH operators? Isn't one enough, right? Because technically one is covering the entire country, it should be perfectly fine. If I go back, and I've been part of some of the original business cases that were developed for DTH operators way back in 1997, 1998, the assumption was that the maximum number of DTH subs that would exist in India would be about 5 million, right? And that the average price that a subscriber would pay would be about $30, right? And if there was only one satellite operator, only one DTH operator, the reality would have been relatively close to that, because you would have had a near monopoly position. The fact that we had this proliferation of DTH operators created an incredible, a very, very competitive environment that allowed us to get to where we are. The cheapest DTH offering in the world that today addresses 12.5 to 15 crore Indian subscribers, providing them with education, entertainment, and information in an unprecedentedly inexpensive manner. if we didn't have this liberalization, we would have never seen the unlocking of this incredible amount of value that has been created. And I'm not talking about in the context of for the satellite sector, because I consider that almost to be secondary. The value that this created for the content producers, for the installers, for the television manufacturers, for this entire ecosystem. And I think if you track the growth of DTH subs in India, it tracks very closely with the amount of content that is created in India, with the amount of installers. This entire ecosystem grows rapidly as you have more liberalized, a more liberalized economic environment. So what we've seen is we've gone from 200 SD channels in 2005 to over 2,000 channels, all of which means that there are actors being paid. There are light spot boys that are getting employment. There is this entire ecosystem that is being created and creating a positive flywheel of employment, of income generation, etc. So it's really important when we think about the DTH sector, we don't look at it as the DTH sector that benefits a few transponders. That's not what it's about. It's about the wider ecosystem that it creates and drives. If we could go to the next slide, please, Akash. Akash? Thank you. Okay, so this is kind of trying to put this all in context, right? We today offer, or we have created, this ecosystem has created opportunities for 350 broadcasters, right? 350 companies that exist in the broadcast space. We offer services to 15 crore, right, pay TV subscribers at 150 to 200 rupees a month, while retaining reasonable and healthy margins for the content producers. In 2019, we created, as an industry, right, direct employment to 6 lakh Indians, 600,000 Indians, and added total output to the economy of over 70,000 crores. And indirectly, because of the flow-on effects, over 2 lakh crores, of which 8,000 crores in GST collections alone, right? So it's telling you what the multiplier effect of a reform regulation. And it's not all just because there was reforms, but reforms massively spurred the scale and what we were able to achieve as an industry as a result of some of these reforms that took place, right? And then a really important point that I want to make, right? There's a lot of discussion around OTT, and I'll talk a little bit about that, related to the reach of broadband, even though we have probably the most robust and most inexpensive broadband over mobile. The reality is that satellite offers the greatest value that can be delivered to consumers. There is no other context by which you could deliver 350 channels with 100 HD, with a few ultra high definition channels, all at a price of 200 rupees using any other infrastructure, right? It is physically impossible to deliver that kind of content, just that sheer volume of content. And then what I would say is what that's translated into is we've grown the total amount of transponders that were available in a combination, as I said, between Insat and foreign satellite operators. And it's created this flywheel, this momentum in the economy. Just coming back to the OTT point, when we look at the amount of advertising revenue, which is ultimately what drives content production, right? The content producers produce content based on advertising and subscription revenues that they make. For Star India, which is now, of course, Disney, the amount of money that they make from advertising on the linear content is 75x what they achieve with Hotstar. Hotstar is really important, don't get me wrong. OTT allows you to consume content when you want it, where you want it. You're in a car, you're in a, you're stuck on a bus in traffic, you have the ability to consume that content. But the vast majority of viewing and advertising revenue that gets generated when you're watching content at home. And almost always, satellite's been a critical enabler in that. And again, I come back to the point, why are we discussing this? Because it forms a context about the liberalization that took place in 2000 and the impact it's had on the economy over the course of these last 21 years. Now, if we move to the next slide, Akash, we look at what this has done from a from a VSAT perspective, right? And once again, we've seen when we opened up the economy and basically allowed more bandwidth to be available. It didn't matter that it was coming from ISRO or Antrix and now NSIL or from international operators. By making more bandwidth available, in the very early days, the industry started off with allowing national stock exchange trading, right? It allowed us to go and provide services to ONGC on offshore locations. It then started the very early stages of ATM and early financial inclusion. We saw initiatives like eChopal, which allows farmers to be able to get information about how to grow their crops. It was a private company that set this up, right? Which was ITC, created eChopal, which addresses, I think, more than 6 million farmers across India and has allowed them to become much more productive in the farming that they do. If you look at eGram, which is an initiative in Gujarat, which allowed e-government services, all of these were enabled because we opened up the satellite sector. We created a positive momentum that had a massive impact on downstream users. And I think this is the really important point. And I'm only scratching the surface when I talk about two parts of this, right? Which is the VSAT side and the video ecosystem. What ISRO's capacity has done for disaster relief, what it has done for national security, these are immeasurably important enablers that can only exist because we have the presence of significant satellite that existed without the reforms from ISRO, but it's been able to be leveraged up. It's become much more meaningful and impactful because we opened up the sector significantly, right? Akash, if you could go to the next couple of slides, please. So I was just talking about, what some of the initiatives around the data side have been. We are now at well over 400,000 VSATs across the country. As I said, eChopal is connecting 35,000 villages. eGram, I think, is a really interesting example of a self-funding e-government initiative. And this is really important. It's not being funded by government aid all the time. It is a self-funding network that has allowed us to take government out of Ahmedabad and deliver it across all of Gujarat. And finally, we've created a 1,000 crore VSAT market that every year creates employment, creates opportunities, creates jobs for installers, and has this very important effect on financial inclusion, on making sure that e-government reaches end users, in making sure that we're able to provide services to Indians irrespective of where they are. Just because you're an Indian that sits in Delhi or Bombay should not privilege you to get greater access to services from the government as compared to if you are in a small rural village. Satellite disintermediates different distances. It makes sure that there is no digital divide that exists because of where you sit. And I think that's a really, really important enabler. So if we were to go to the next slide, Akash. In my opinion, and Tom's talked about some of the very important sort of aspects that, the next wave of reforms, what these reforms can bring. Akash, if you could move to the next slide, please. Thank you. Perfect. So I think there are some really big picture aspects to the reforms. It's actually unleashing private enterprise in India. It is ensuring that you have small companies that can innovate in this space and be able to, create the kind of value that we're seeing in many Western economies. You've seen very, very small companies that started out in the space sector that have now become unicorns, right? A unicorn is $1 billion company. We have the ability to create exactly, or to unleash exactly that same potential in India. But there are some very basic things that I think we've got to get right? We have, I would say, some artificial restrictions around what we're allowing technology to do and what we're allowing technology not to do. I think it is incredibly important that we need to open up the availability of Ka band. It is simply another band. There is no magic to it. There is no, there is nothing unique about the band. It is just the same as C. It is just the same as Ku. It just operates at a higher spectrum. But what it allows is us to be able to bring significant high throughput applications with the ultimate aim of bringing down significantly the cost per megabit to the end user, enabling a whole series of new services, a whole series of new applications to be built out, to be able to provide connectivity to the 40,000 villages in India that will never be connected because they sit in the northeast, or because they're on island chains, or because they're in parts of the country that will be very, very difficult, if not impossible, to fiber up. So that's one. Second, I don't completely agree with Tom. I think there is a regulatory framework that needs to be managed. I completely agree that India has to look after its interests as it thinks about how to allow NGSO systems. But I think NGSO systems are a critical path of how you enable, going back to this point, of low cost, low latency services across India. It is supremely important that in the appropriate regulatory framework, we do allow these services to exist, because they are creating opportunities that geo cannot necessarily address. And that's the low latency narrative. It's incredibly important that we have low latency capability for satellites in order to be able to unleash a new set of services and applications. Tom touched upon this point, and I think it's really important. If we look at the total amount of satellite spectrum available to India from the DOT filings alone, inevitably it's going to be difficult, because the orbital arc where we sit, right, in Asia, is an incredibly crowded orbital arc, right? You've got filings that are sitting there from literally every other country that surrounds India. And if we choose to only use the spectrum, or preferably use the spectrum that is Indian, it limits what we can bring to bear. I think there is an enormous opportunity to bring to bear much more spectrum. And again, this can be done in a regulated framework. It can be done by opening up the BSS, for example, right? And what that allows you to do is to free up very important FSS spectrum that is today being used for one-way applications. It was never intended really for that. You can unlock this enormous amount of FSS spectrum by using BSS spectrum for what it was intended for, which is for delivery of one-way video, right? That's how it's been framed at the ITU. That's how it's operated around the world. And if you liberalize the Indian satellite system, you will create this symbiotic relationship between Indian private entrepreneurs, international spectrum, that we have a limited amount of spectrum. So bringing in international spectrum, regulating it in an appropriate manner, but at the same time making sure that India has much more spectrum to grow satellite services rather than the limited amount of spectrum that we have at the moment. There are two sort of concerns, I would say. Ka-band already is, I think, in many ways unlocks a significant amount of future potential. Spectrum is really valuable, and how you use spectrum is really, really important. And I think once you start to use the same frequencies terrestrially and satellite, so make them what is called co-primary, you are inevitably going to end up with a significant amount of interference. I think there is a path where the terrestrial 5G could very easily open up the 26 gigahertz spectrum, leaving satellite to use the 27.5 to the 28.5 gigahertz of spectrum, therefore allowing a coexistence without having this conflict of terrestrial and satellite being co-primary. I think that would be a significant challenge to bring to bear the kind of volume of capacity that only, I think, Ka-band can bring in terms of high throughput applications and a significant scaling up of the amount of capacity. What we're trying to get to is really, I think, in my mind, two outputs. A really low cost per megabit that enables many new business cases and many new applications to come about, and low latency, because as we go into 5G and many other protocols, latency is becoming more and more of an issue and cannot only be served by GEO. It needs to have MEO in the mix. It needs to have LEO in the mix. If we could go to the next slide, please, Akash. Sorry, if you could please keep going. And one more. Thank you. So, in my humble opinion, right, there is no one size fits all, right? I remember making a presentation in Bangalore, I think it was 7 or 8 years ago, and even from that time, I've sincerely believed that certain technologies, whether it's Geo, MEO, or LEO, are appropriate for certain use cases. Video distribution will not be done well by high throughput spot beam satellites. It just is not the right application for it. But if you want to do significant trunking, MEO is the most appropriate technology. If you want to do consumer broadband, LEO is the most appropriate technology. So there is a place for each of these orbital arcs to coexist, and they have to coexist if we're going to solve the problem of trying to unlock satellites' role as a multiplier in the economy and satellites' role in really unlocking access and connectivity to over 1.2 billion Indians, right? Next slide, please. Thank you. Let's talk for a moment about terrestrial, right? Because this is, we often talk about the fact that there's going to be ubiquitous fiber on the ground in India. We're going to have every household which is connected by, fiber. I think we should take a pause and understand where we are at the moment. 7.6% of Indian households have broadband penetration. And, we've done a lot of work already in investing in terrestrial broadband, but there is an enormous amount of work that is still to be done. We will not have credible, reliable fiber in many parts of the northeast, in the Himalayas, and many of the islands. Only 33% of the mobile towers in India have fiber access. The rest are operating with microwave. And as the amount of demand for video grows at the end from the final BTS tower, you're not going to be able to daisy chain microwave adequately in order to be able to provide the kind of throughput that you need to the end devices. And then finally, 40,000 villages in India still don't have 3G or 4G. So I think 5G is a long way away. Satellite is a part of solving this problem. It is not the answer. It is a fundamental part of the answer to solving this problem. And then I want to just spend a minute on the OTT aspects, and I'm just about to wrap up, so I apologize if I've gone a little bit over. The cost of passing a home is $100 per household, right? And if you look at not every household that you pass converts, the typical conversion ratio is for every 10 houses that you pass, only 2 will actually take service from you. The capex involved in passing a home in India with fiber is $500, right? And if the yield that you get on it as a service provider, right, as someone who's deploying the fiber, the maximum that you can get out of that fiber, out of that home pass, is $6 or $7. There is a mismatch, and it's unlikely that we're going to have much fiber deployment, significant fiber deployment to the home outside of the major metros where there is significant propensity to spend, and where $7, $8, $10 is a possibility for a household bill. And then finally, I'd love to talk about DTH as why I think DTH will exist for many, many years to come, right? A lot of people tend to think, well, now we've got Hotstar, we've got Amazon Prime, we've got Netflix, it's all done, DTH satellite is going away. I go back to this value proposition that I shared with you. A DTH operator for 200 to 300 rupees delivers close to 300 channels, which includes 100 channels of HD. A comparable stack of content from an OTT provider, just looking at Netflix and Eros and Z5 and Hotstar, if you add these all up to have the same amount of content that you would have with a DTH provider, you're at nearly 700 rupees already. It's unaffordable, right? So there is going to be a place for OTT where it will coexist with DTH, but I continue to believe very strongly that in India and in many other markets across the world, direct-to-home satellite television will deliver a bulk of the content, augmented by OTT and internet television, internet-delivered television. If we could go to the next slide, please, Akash. So that's my sort of summary slide, if you will. I think if we're going to unlock the value of what we can bring as a telecommunications sector across India, when we're addressing maritime, energy, aero, disaster response, government services, bringing the cloud, which is increasingly important, to the edge of the network rather than only having the cloud sit in Delhi or Mumbai. Using the continued use of satellite for broadcasting and video, we are going to need this ecosystem where we have geostationary satellites, MEOs, LEOs, very important part of an ecosystem that also includes fiber to the tower, fiber to the home, and other terrestrial technologies. So I will just leave it at that. I think this combination of technologies is really important for us to be able to unleash, in my opinion, the second phase of economic reforms, second phase of regulatory reforms, and the multiplier effect that that has on the economy, as we've seen, has been massive in the past, and I'm absolutely convinced will be massive in the future. I'll stop there. Thank you.